Hello, and welcome to Round Robin. I'm your host, Robin McCormick, and today my guest is Mike Cobb from the History Museum. Welcome, Mike.
Robin, good to be here.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about something a little different today, the War of 1812.
America's forgotten war.
It is. You know, I reached back deep into my history brain, and I have to tell you, I don't remember a whole lot about it. And when I think 100th anniversary, I think, well, okay, 1812 was a year ago, so why are we talking about this now?
Well, we're on the anniversary of the attack on Hampton in 1813, so we're looking at this
from the local anniversary
this crucial anniversary. And Hampton has several connections with this forgotten war, the War of 1812. A war which, by the way, we won very few battles. Somehow we came out winning the war, so to speak, but we lost most of the battles.
Maybe I've just gotten tired of fighting over here again
that's
and spending
what
all
happens.
that money. Was it sort of the second war for independence?
It's America's second war for independence with Great Britain. Of course, the first being the American Revolution. Then in the early 1800s, tensions increased. Of course, if you look at the world setting, the Napoleonic Wars are going on. Britain and is at war with France. In fact, the entire world is at war at that point. And Britain needs sailors for its navy. So it begins impressing American sailors.
Impressing means drafting, right?
Kidnapping.
Kidnapping. Worse than drafting.
Kidnapping,
okay.
yeah. And often it was done on the high seas, so they would commandeer American ships, not respecting the young republic. And that's part of what's going on here.
Okay.
Britain is still not happy about the outcome of the American Revolution.
Still thinks we're a little bit of a colony.
We're still a naughty child in many ways to the British, and so they are impressing sailors from American ships. This certainly hurts American pride, and at one point, an American ship, the Chesapeake, is commanded by James Barron. Now, James Barron has strong connections to Hampton and to Norfolk, but he's one of America's great commodores, and he's commanding our warship Chesapeake. Now, the British suspect that Barron has British seamen aboard his ship, and it's ported in Norfolk. So they actually publish in the papers that they suspect this, and they want them back, and they threaten to take them.
Ooh.
Yeah, so this is all ignored. Barron sails out one fine morning out the Elizabeth River into Hampton Roads and then into the Chesapeake Bay. And Robin, when he passes Lynnhaven Inlet, there is a British man of war there, the Leopard.
Uh-oh.
Leopard sees Chesapeake approaching, knew it was coming, and Leopard sets sail and follows Chesapeake into the Atlantic. A confrontation is imminent. The Leopard approaches, fires shots at the Chesapeake. Barron did not defend the Chesapeake. In fact, he was quoted as saying, "Take cover, boys," and the shells came flying through the...
and this is what year? This is before 1812?
This is before,
okay.
This is 1807. This is before the war, and splinters fly and such on the ship, and the Leopard pulls alongside and boards the American warship. Now that's a great insult to any nation.
Could be almost a declaration of war right there if it could have sparked the battles early.
Wars have started over a lot less. At any rate, the British haul off sailors that they consider to be British. Now, this is a major cause of the War of 1812. America is up in arms over this insult to its dignity. It also leads to a very famous duel because Stephen Decatur, another British American admiral, suggests that Barron was not as brave as he might have been.
He should have fought.
Barron, who was a brave man, took exception to this. The two men met in a dueling field near Washington, D.C. in the early morning, and James Barron killed Stephen Decatur.
Oh my gosh.
And that is certainly an epic duel in the story of our nation. But this is the tensions that are rising that bring us to War of 1812. And certainly Hampton has those strong connections, as Hampton Roads does. Now, the next thing is, as the war progresses, we're losing the battles. And this war is fought largely on the sea. It's land and
Very
sea.
much a
but
naval.
the British Navy is so strong. 1813 comes along, the second year of the war. The British want to draw American soldiers out of Canada. So they threaten Hampton Roads, so we have to bring our troops back to help defend. So they send a large fleet here. And the fleet has men of war and support ships and several thousand British regulars and Royal Marines and some Frenchmen who were prisoners but also were aiding the British. So they come into Hampton Roads. Of course, our waterways, Robin, the beautiful Chesapeake, the beautiful Hampton Roads are avenues of commerce, but in wartime, they're avenues of invasion.
Yeah.
So we're vulnerable. In this nuclear age, it's hard for us to understand how vulnerable we are to attack by sea. Well, the British come in to attack Norfolk because the warship Constellation is in Norfolk, right off of Fort Norfolk. The British fleet comes in, sails up the Elizabeth River with the idea of leveling Norfolk, but they are stopped. They're stopped by Virginia militia at Craney Island. The Craney Islands still exist.
Oh, okay.
Is getting larger as it becomes a landfill, but at any rate, there's a battle fought there. And the Virginians and their allies defeat the British, push them back. This is a very rare instance of an American victory during this forgotten war, the Battle of Craney Island. Now, the British used their Cosgrave rockets, very frightening. They go flying in the air and they blow up and they cause a lot of alarm and such. It was quite a little fray, but the Americans come out on top and Norfolk is saved. The British are angry and frustrated, so they sail across Hampton Roads Harbor to Little Hampton. Now, Hampton is not as well defended as Norfolk was. The British land their troops at Sealy's and other points and move towards the town of Hampton. We have our militia here, and they defend Hampton, and they put up a pretty good resistance. But they are defeated, and the British eventually enter the town of Hampton. Now, what happens next is mayhem. It's hard to tell exactly what happened, but the citizens of Hampton, many of them were assaulted. Men and women were brutalized by this invading force, and to the point that it became a rallying cry for the Americans in the War of 1812.
Really?
Yes.
Oh.
Yes. In fact, when Andrew Jackson was defending New Orleans in 1814 against a British attack, Jackson told the citizens of New Orleans, "Remember Hampton. If you surrender this town to the British invaders, you could experience the same devastation that the little town of Hampton did." So it had a far-reaching effect throughout the country. Now, what really happened is hard to know. The British had a court of inquiry afterwards to investigate. Apparently there was beatings and possibly rapes and other atrocities accounted for that day. And so the British end up sort of blaming their French allies on whatever happened in Hampton, but that day in Hampton certainly had an effect on the outcome of the war, because New Orleans was the greatest American victory in the war. Although it was fought after the war had ended, it still had a lot of psychological and also political benefits for the country. Now, our museum, the Hampton History Museum, has an amazing artifact from that day, from that fight in Hampton. We call it the Rutherford rifle.
Rutherford rifle, okay.
It was made by Archibald Rutherford, a gunsmith in the Shenandoah Valley. And that rifle and others were made for the state of Virginia to arm our militia.
So that was what our folks were fighting with.
Our folks were fighting with that. And the rifle, it was marked Elizabeth City County on the barrel, Virginia Manufactory on the lock plate, and one of our soldiers had that rifle in his hands. And the British drove the Americans from the field, and our guy drops the rifle and takes off. One of the British commanders, Sir Charles Napier, gets the rifle and takes it home with him. And we have his obituary, Robin. When he died, his war trophies, shields and swords from India and around the world, were around his cot in his last moments. And I'm sure that rifle was there too. Sir Charles passes away. The rifle remains in his family for several generations. In the 1970s, it comes to America through Sotheby's. It goes through a couple of hands, and our museum, the Hampton History Museum, through a very determined drive by our citizens, raised a considerable amount of money to purchase this rifle. And a Rutherford rifle today is in the galleries of the Hampton History Museum, and it is one of the premier artifacts from the War of 1812 in Virginia.
And it was used by our militia right here defending Hampton.
In 1813, in the Forgotten War.
Oh, see, this is more exciting than I thought. You are a good storyteller.
We have a letter. We have a letter that we acquired in New Orleans from a woman who was living far from here. But when she heard about Hampton, she was scared to death. And her name was Margaret Bib, and she wrote her sister, who was living in Port Republic in the Shenandoah Valley, and she talked about the atrocities in Hampton, that the barbarous British did this and that to the defenseless citizens of Hampton. And she ends her letter with, God save us from these British barbarians is the affectionate prayer of your sister. That's how devastating the attack on Hampton was.
So did they destroy, what was Hampton like in 1813?
Small village,
okay.
Very pleasant by the sea, and beautiful homes and such. It's hard to determine exactly how much damage was done. Certainly St. John's Church was damaged and other buildings, but there was damage.
So kind of pillaging, maybe fire, maybe not,
Probably
more pillaging.
More pillaging, and certainly there was assault on persons. Now, the British had their headquarters, Robin, in one of the finest houses in Hampton, the Westwood House. The Westwood House stood near where our carousel is today, and that is where the British gathered their plunder to store before they were to sail off. But it was a long time before Hamptonians forgot the visit by the British in the July of 1813.
So and how long was the occupation? How long did they stay?
They were here for a matter of days,
okay.
But it was long enough,
right,
certainly.
Right, and they took with them anything they wanted at that point.
And they went on up the bay and threatened other cities and towns, including Baltimore and Washington, D.C., and that's where our Star-Spangled Banner comes from, is the bombardment of Baltimore during this time. So all this is connected. And the biggest effect, the biggest impact this event has on Hampton is, as you know, after the War of 1812, the American government embarked upon the largest building program in American history. And that was building fortifications from Maine to the Gulf of Mexico to defend the American coast against the British and other Europeans who might threaten us.
Because that's still a threat, and wars are still fought an awful lot, at least between the continents, on sea. And so they began to build
these massive fortifications. And here in Hampton Roads, two are built, and they are Fort Monroe and originally Fort Calhoun, later named Fort Wool. And the idea of that was to defend the entrance to Hampton Roads so ships could not come into the harbor, go up the Elizabeth River and attack Norfolk and Portsmouth, go up the James River and attack Richmond, or go up the Hampton River and attack our town of Hampton. So Fort Monroe and Fort Calhoun, later Wool, are the result of the devastation during the War of 1812 that the British Army and Navy wrought upon American arms during this tragic period.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that history lesson. I, forget, because Hampton was such the center of the Civil War, and we've just celebrated an anniversary and kind of gone through that history, the War of 1812 gets a little bit overlooked, and many of us forget our history lessons from school.
It is America's forgotten war.
Yeah, well, one of them, I guess. Some people would say Korea is also one, but yeah, that's really interesting. So what we could do to mark this anniversary would be to come to the History Museum and see this gun.
Come to the Hampton History Museum and see the Rutherford rifle, and also the letter that I described, and many other artifacts related to Hampton. A wonderful day to come and remember America's forgotten war, the War of 1812.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate it. And thank you for watching. I hope you've learned as much as I have, and we'll go see the Rutherford gun. Thank you.